The parking lot behind St. Anthony's Church smelled like wet asphalt and diesel, and I had been sitting in my car for 11 days. Not my car, technically. It was a 2009 Ford Escape with a cracked rear bumper and a heater that worked about 40% of the time. My ex-wife's name was still on the registration. She hadn't asked for it back yet, probably because she knew it wasn't worth the conversation. It was a Tuesday in early March, somewhere around 5:30 in the morning, and the temperature had dropped to 22 degrees overnight. I know that because the little display on the dashboard had stopped updating at 22, which either meant it had actually gotten colder than the sensor could read, or the sensor itself had finally given up. I understood how it felt. I was 41 years old. I had been a structural engineer for 16 years. I had a son named Marcus who was 8, who was currently living with his mother in a 2-bedroom apartment in Raleigh, and who had called me the week before to ask if I was coming to his school play. I told him I would try. I didn't go. I couldn't tell him that I was living in a parking lot, that I had exactly $63 to my name, or that the last real meal I had eaten was a turkey sandwich from a gas station in Cary 2 days prior. Some things you protect your kids from for as long as you possibly can. I had a coat. That was something. A heavy canvas work jacket I'd bought years ago when I thought I was the kind of man who did weekend projects around the house. It still had a measuring tape in the left pocket. I don't know why I never took it out, maybe because it reminded me of a version of myself I was hoping to get back to. I was sitting in the driver's seat, both hands wrapped around a gas station coffee that had gone cold, watching the sky go from black to gray when someone knocked on my window. I flinched so hard I hit my elbow on the steering wheel. The man standing outside was not what I expected at 6 in the morning in a church parking lot. He was wearing a dark charcoal overcoat, the kind with a structured collar that sits just right, and he was holding a leather folio under one arm. Maybe 60 years old, silver hair, clean-shaven. He looked like he had somewhere important to be, and somehow that somewhere important had turned out to be next to my car. I rolled down the window about 4 inches. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. His voice was calm, professional. "I'm looking for someone. I want to make sure I have the right person." I say more. He paused. "Are you Grant Harmon?" I stared at him. "Who's asking?" "My name is Stuart Pelham," he said. "I'm an attorney. I've been looking for you for a little over 3 weeks. My name is Grant Harmon." That part was true. The rest of the story, the part that explains why a 41-year-old engineer with a master's degree from NC State was sleeping in a parking lot in 30-degree weather, takes a little longer to tell. My mother, Beverly, had raised me by herself in a duplex in Durham, North Carolina. She worked as a medical billing specialist for most of my childhood, and later as an office manager for a small orthopedic practice. She was practical, careful with money, and absolutely relentless in exactly one area. She believed I was capable of more than our circumstances suggested. She said it so often that eventually I started to believe it too. My father left when I was 4. I have exactly one memory of him, sitting on a porch somewhere, him handing me a red popsicle, and I can't even be certain it's real. He had a brother, my Uncle Frank, who my mother described as cut from the same cloth. She said it without bitterness, just as a matter of fact, the way you'd describe the weather. I didn't think about either of them much. I had my mother, I had school, and eventually I had a career that I was genuinely good at. I joined a mid-sized structural engineering firm in Raleigh right out of grad school and spent the next decade doing the kind of steady, competent work that doesn't make headlines but keeps buildings from falling down. I liked it. I was good at the math and better at the problem solving, and there was something deeply satisfying about signing off on a structure you knew would stand for 50 years. I got married at 32 to a woman named Denise. She was smart, funny, and had strong opinions about furniture that I found endearing for the first few years. We had Marcus at 33. For a while we were something that looked a lot like happy. The marriage started unraveling slowly, and then all at once, the way those things tend to go. I won't put all of it on her. I worked too much. I was distracted. I had a version of myself I was always trying to become that didn't leave a lot of room for the version that came home tired and behind on yard work. By the time Marcus was 5, Denise and I were having the same argument in different rooms on different nights, and by the time he was 6, we had agreed to separate. The divorce was not ugly. That was almost worse in a way. It was civil and reasonable and completely devastating, and by the end of it I had moved into an apartment in Cary, paid out a settlement that felt fair and also catastrophic, and reduced my monthly income to something that covered rent and child support and almost nothing else. Then I got laid off. The firm downsized. 15 people in 3 weeks. I was one of them. They gave me a 4-week severance and a reference letter that I have never once been asked to produce. I spent the first month applying to every structural engineering position in a 200-mile radius. I spent the second month expanding that search. By month 3, I was applying to project management roles, construction coordinator positions, anything that touched a blueprint. By month 4, I was doing the math on my savings account and feeling something I had never felt before, a kind of quiet, airless panic, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, it just settles in and starts rearranging the furniture. I lost the apartment in February. I had been 3 months behind on rent, and my landlord, who was not an unreasonable man, finally had no choice. I packed what I could fit in the Ford Escape and drove to the St. Anthony's parking lot because I had read online that the church allowed overnight parking for people in transition. They didn't ask questions. They left a note under my wiper once that said, "Coffee and breakfast available 7 a.m. weekdays." I went twice. Both times I sat in the back and didn't speak to anyone because I could not yet say out loud what had happened to me. Denise didn't know. I had told her I was between apartments. Marcus didn't know anything, only that Dad's new place wasn't ready yet. My mother didn't know because she had enough to carry at 72 with her hip replacement recovery, and I was not going to add this to her list. I had become very good at maintaining the performance of a man who was fine. So when Stuart Pelham knocked on my window at 5:30 in the morning in that parking lot, I had been performing for nearly 4 months. He didn't want to talk outside. He asked if we could find somewhere warm, and I almost laughed, because the inside of the Ford Escape at that hour was not what I would have called warm. But I rolled up the window and got out, and he walked me to a diner 2 blocks away called Patsy's that I hadn't been inside because I was rationing the $63. He ordered coffee for both of us and a plate of eggs without asking me, which I chose to interpret as professional efficiency rather than pity, though I suspect it was some of both. "Mr. Harmon," he said, setting his portfolio on the table, "I need to start by asking you a few verification questions. Standard process, is that all right?" He asked for my date of birth, my mother's maiden name, my social security number, the last 4 digits, and the name of the city where I was born. I answered all of them. He compared something in his folder, nodded slowly, and then folded his hands on the table. "Your father's name was Gary Harmon," he said. I nodded. I hadn't said the name out loud in probably 15 years. Gary had an older brother, your uncle Franklin Harmon. "Did you have any contact with him?" "No," I said. "My mother mentioned him once or twice when I was a kid. I don't think they ever met, actually. I know I never did." Stuart Pelham nodded as though this confirmed something he already knew. Franklin Harmon passed away 6 weeks ago. He was 78. He lived most of his adult life in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he ran a small commercial real estate business for about 40 years. He paused. He was not a wealthy man in the traditional sense, Mr. Harmon, but he was extraordinarily careful with money over an extraordinarily long period of time. He owned 11 properties outright. No mortgages. He had significant investment accounts that had compounded for decades. When we completed the accounting of his estate, the total came to approximately $4.2 million. I looked at him. I did not say anything. "Franklin was never married," Stuart continued. "He had no children. Your father, Gary, was his only sibling, and Gary passed away 7 years ago in Phoenix, which makes you, to the best of our research, Franklin's only surviving heir." The coffee arrived. I wrapped both hands around the mug the way I had been wrapping them around the gas station cup for weeks, and I stared at the table. "I need to be honest with you," Stuart said. "Franklin's will is not straightforward. He left instructions. And there is a condition." I looked up. What kind of condition? The condition was this. Franklin Harmon had spent the last decade of his life doing something he had never spoken about publicly. He had quietly funded a transitional housing program in Pittsburgh's Hill District neighborhood, a small operation, 12 units, that provided temporary housing for men coming out of homelessness or incarceration. He hadn't started the program, but he had kept it alive for 10 years with a combination of donations and below-market rent on a building he owned. The program was called Steady Ground. It served, on average, about 30 men per year. The director of Steady Ground, a woman named Patricia who had run the program since its founding, was retiring at the end of the year. The board had not found a replacement. The program was understaffed, underfunded, and in real danger of closing. Franklin's condition was specific. To receive the estate, I had to spend 1 full year working at Steady Ground, not as a donor, not as an advisor, not as a board member, as a staff member. Whatever they needed, whatever Patricia needed. At the end of the year, if Patricia and the board attested that I had fulfilled the role in good faith, the estate transferred to me. In the meantime, Franklin had arranged a monthly living stipend, $1,200, to cover basic expenses during the year. Not comfortable. Enough. If I declined or failed to complete the year, the estate would be liquidated and the funds distributed to 3 nonprofits Franklin had specified in a secondary provision. Stuart Pelham slid the document across the table and let me read it twice. When I looked up, he was watching me with the careful, neutral expression of a man who has delivered many things to many people and has learned not to project onto any of them. "He never met me," I said. "No, he didn't know anything about my situation. He knew you existed. He had been aware of you for some time, apparently. He had a private investigator's report from about 8 years ago. Basic information, where you were living, that you had a son. He didn't interfere or reach out, but he kept track. I thought about that. A 70-something man in Pittsburgh who had never once contacted me, keeping a quiet, careful eye on a nephew he'd never met. I didn't know what to do with it. Why the condition? I asked. Why not just leave it outright?" Stuart was quiet for a moment. "He left a letter," he said. "It's included in the packet. He explains his thinking there better than I can. I read the letter that night, sitting in the Ford Escape with the dome light on because I had nowhere else to go. Franklin's handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who didn't waste space. He wrote that he had made his money slowly, property by property, through patience and discipline and the willingness to do unglamorous work for a long time. He wrote that the thing he was most proud of was not the money itself, but what the money had allowed him to do at Steady Ground, where he had watched men who had lost everything rebuild themselves from nothing, one day at a time, and where he had come to believe that the single most important thing a person in crisis needed was not charity but stability and the visible proof that someone believed in their ability to recover. He wrote that he did not know me. He acknowledged that plainly. He wrote that he had no way of knowing what kind of man I had become, and that he was not trying to impose his values on me or test my character. He wrote that the condition was not a test. It was, he said, a gift he didn't know how to give any other way. He wrote, I spent most of my life in rooms with men who had more than enough, and I noticed that the ones who had everything often understood very little, and the ones who had lost everything often understood nearly everything. I am not a philosopher. I just kept my eyes open for a long time. If you do this year, I believe you will understand why I found this work worth doing. That understanding, in my experience, is worth more than the money. The money is just the incentive to get you in the room. I sat in the dark for a long time after I finished reading. The dome light flickered twice and went out. I didn't turn it back on. I called Stuart Pelham the next morning and told him I would do it. He said he had expected I would need more time. I told him I had made the decision at approximately 2 in the morning and had spent the hours since then thinking about how to tell Denise and my mother without either of them realizing quite how bad things had gotten. He was diplomatic enough not to ask follow-up questions. I drove to Pittsburgh in the Ford Escape on a Sunday in mid-March. The stipend had been wired to an account Stuart had helped me set up. I had rented a room in a boarding house 6 blocks from Steady Ground, shared bathroom, no kitchen access, a window that looked directly at another building's brick wall. It was the best room I had slept in 11 weeks. Patricia was a 64-year-old woman from Pittsburgh's Homewood neighborhood who had the kind of energy that made you feel slightly inadequate just standing next to her. She was brisk and warm at the same time, in a way I didn't know was possible until I met her. She had short natural hair that was going gray at the temples, and she wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she could hold 4 conversations simultaneously while also managing a spreadsheet on a computer that looked like it predated the Obama administration. She shook my hand on my first morning, looked at me steadily, and said, I already know about the will, Stuart told me. I want to be straight with you. I don't need a babysitter or a benefactor. I need someone who can do the work. If you're here to feel good about yourself for a year and then go back to your real life, we'll figure that out pretty quickly and it won't serve either of us. She paused. Fair enough, I said yes. Good, she said. Start with the storage room. We've been meaning to reorganize it since January. The storage room took 3 days. After that came intake paperwork, which Patricia walked me through with minimal patience for errors. After that came morning shift, which meant being at the building by 7 to make sure the common areas were open, and the coffee was on, and the men coming through the door had somewhere to sit before the day's programming started. After that came what Patricia called case coordination, which in practice meant learning the names and situations of 32 men, keeping notes updated, making calls to employers and parole officers and social workers, and being present in a way that was attentive without being intrusive. I was terrible at most of it at first. I had spent 16 years working in a field where problems were solved with equations and the correct answer was objectively correct. Steady Ground ran on a completely different logic, one where the right response to a man having a bad morning was not a solution but a presence, where progress was nonlinear and sometimes looked like backsliding, where your job on any given day might be to sit across from someone who had just been rejected from their 14th job application and simply not look away. It took me about 3 weeks to stop looking for the formula. There was a man named Arthur who had been in and out of Steady Ground twice before and was on his 3rd stay. He was 47, formerly a pipe fitter, had lost his housing after a back injury took him out of work, and the combination of pain and isolation had led to a period he described carefully as a bad few years. He was funny and acerbic and could tell when you were performing concern rather than feeling it, and he called me out on it twice in my first 2 weeks in a way that was direct enough to be useful and kind enough not to be cruel. You're trying to fix people, he told me one afternoon. We were playing cards, not as a program activity, just 2 people playing cards at a table. That's not what this place is. This place is just somewhere to be while you work out your own thing. The best you can do is make the room feel steady. I thought about that. Make the room feel steady. It wasn't so different in structure from what I had spent my career doing with buildings. There was also a young man named Curtis, 23, who had aged out of foster care at 18 and spent the next 5 years moving between couch surfing and shelter stays. He was studying for his GED in the evenings and had been accepted to a welding certification program that started in September, contingent on his maintaining stable housing through the summer. He was meticulous about the calendar on the wall in the common room where he marked off days until the program started. I watched him mark off days every morning for months. I started helping him study for the math sections of the GED. We met 3 times a week at the common room table after dinner. He was smart and fast and deeply impatient with himself when he made mistakes. I told him that impatience was a feature, not a bug. It meant he cared. He told me that was something a person with a master's degree would say. We kept meeting anyway. I called Marcus every Sunday. I told him I was working in Pittsburgh for a year on a special project. He asked if I could come see his soccer games. I drove back to Raleigh 3 times that spring to watch him play. He scored twice in April on a cold Saturday morning and ran straight to me after the second goal with the completely uninhibited joy of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to temper his happiness, and I stood there on that sideline and felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. I told my mother in April. I drove to Durham on a Sunday and sat in her kitchen and told her everything, the layoff, the apartment, the parking lot, all of it. She sat across from me and listened without interrupting, which was not her natural tendency. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Grant, you should have called me. I know. I'm your mother. I know." She got up and refilled my coffee and sat back down and said, "All right. Tell me about Pittsburgh." I talked for an hour. She asked questions the whole time, sharp, specific questions about the men in the program, about Patricia, about what the work actually looked like day to day. She had always been interested in the concrete details of things. It was where I had learned it. Before I left, she told me something. She said that she had known Franklin Harmon's name, not well, but she had heard it. She said that my father had mentioned his brother occasionally, always with a complicated mix of admiration and resentment. Franklin was the one who had done something with his life. Gary was the one who had left. She said she had never expected anything from that side of the family and had never wanted to. "But I'm glad it was you he found," she said. "I think he knew what he was doing." In June, Steady Ground came close to losing its lease. The building Franklin had owned, the one where the 12 units were located, had passed to me as part of the estate structure, but the legal transfer was still processing, and in the meantime the property management company that had been handling Franklin's affairs sent a notice that rent for the common area facilities was 30 days past due to an administrative error in the transition, $3,400. The amount, in the context of a $4 million estate, was almost absurd. In the context of Steady Ground's operating budget, it was a crisis. I called Stewart. Stewart said the estate transfer would clear the backlog within 60 days, but 60 days was too long. I used the last of what I had in a personal savings account I had been holding in reserve, $3,412. I had been carrying it for months as a psychological anchor, the number that separated me from total zero, and I used it without deliberating too long, because the thing that needed doing was clear, and I had gotten, over the previous 3 months, considerably better at doing what was clear without stopping to mourn what it cost. Patricia found out a week later when the accounting sorted itself out. She came to find me in the storage room where I was reorganizing donated clothing by size again because the previous organization system had collapsed under the weight of a particularly large donation from a church in Squirrel Hill. She stood in the doorway and looked at me for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The alternative was worse." She nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said, "it was." She paused. "You're getting better at this." Coming from Patricia, that was roughly the equivalent of a standing ovation. Curtis passed the GD in July. All 4 sections, first attempt. He didn't make a big deal of it. He came into the common room on a Thursday morning and put the results printout on the table in front of me without saying anything, and I looked at it and then looked at him, and he was trying very hard to be the kind of person who didn't show too much, which was a thing I recognized because I had spent years being that person, and I said Curtis and he said yeah, and I put my hand out and he shook it and then he sat down and ate his cereal. I kept the coffee going for another 40 minutes because I could tell he didn't want to be alone with it yet. He started the welding program in September. I drove him on the first morning because Patricia asked me to, and because the bus would have taken an hour and 40 minutes. We didn't talk much on the ride. He looked out the window at Pittsburgh going past and he said once, "You think it'll be like this after? Feeling like you're about to fail at something new every morning?" "Probably," I said. "I think that's just what moving forward feels like." He was quiet for a moment. "That's inconvenient," he said. "Deeply," I agreed. "I want to tell you what the year looked like from inside it, because from outside I know it probably sounds like a tidy narrative. Man hits bottom, serves his time, collects his reward. That's not what it was. What it was a Monday in October when a man named Douglas came back after 2 weeks away and was clearly in worse shape than when he left, and I sat with him for 4 hours while Patricia was at a city council meeting and I had absolutely no idea whether anything I was doing was helping or making it worse. What it was a February evening when I called Marcus and he asked again when I was coming home and I said soon and he said that's what I always said and he was right and I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. What it was the specific texture of Pittsburgh in November, the cold that comes up off the river and gets into your coat, and the way the common room at Steady Ground looked with the heat on and the overhead light buzzing and Arthur dealing cards to anyone who sat down, and the feeling of a place that was against all odds working. What it was learning, slowly and with considerable resistance, that I had been confusing motion with progress for most of my adult life, that I had been so focused on the version of myself I was working toward that I had been mostly absent from the version of myself that was actually here. That my son had 8 more years before he left for college, and I had been spending them building a career that was now gone, rather than building something that would last. I don't know how to explain what a year of that kind of work does to a person except to say that you come out of it knowing things that you didn't before, and not in the way that knowledge usually accumulates, not as addition, but as replacement. Like certain things that seemed load-bearing turned out to be decorative, and certain things that seemed decorative turned out to hold up the whole structure. In February, 12 months to the week after I had first spoken to Stuart Pelham, Patricia and the board submitted their attestation. Stuart handled the legal transfer. The estate, buildings, accounts, all of it, moved into my name over the course of about 3 weeks. I was sitting in the common room at Steady Ground the morning it finalized because that was where I was every morning. I did not move to a penthouse. I kept the boarding house room through the end of March while I figured out the next steps. I hired an estate attorney who was not Stuart Pelham but who came recommended by Stuart Pelham, and we spent a lot of time talking about structures, trusts, LLCs, long-term management plans, in a way that felt unexpectedly a lot like the structural engineering work I had spent years doing, finding the right form to make sure something stands. The Steady Ground building was already mine, legally, which simplified one thing considerably. Patricia agreed to extend for another year while we worked on succession. I joined the board. I am not the director and I don't intend to be. That job requires someone who is better at it than I am, but I am useful in specific ways and I have learned over the past year that being useful in specific ways is not a consolation prize. I moved back to Raleigh in April. I rented a house, not a large one, close to Marcus's school. I told Denise the whole story. She was quiet for a long time after, in the way people are quiet when they are recalibrating something significant. You were living in your car, she said, for 11 days. Grant, I know. You should have told me. I know that now. She looked at me for a moment. There was something in her face that was not the expression of the woman I had been married to. It was something older and steadier than that, and I think it was the expression of someone who has raised a child with another person and knows that the story between them is more complicated than the divorce decree suggests. Is Marcus going to be okay? She asked. With all of this? I think so, I said. I'm planning to be around a lot more. She nodded. Okay, she said. Good. Marcus knows most of the story now. I told him a version of it on a Sunday in May, sitting in the backyard of the rented house, the version calibrated for an 8-year-old who is old enough to understand hard things but doesn't need every detail of every hard thing. I told him that I had gone through a very difficult period and had ended up doing a year of work helping people in Pittsburgh and that it had taught me a lot. He listened carefully the way he always does, with his legs crossed and his chin in his hand. Were you scared? He asked. Yeah, I said. For a while I was pretty scared. He thought about that. But it worked out, it did, because you did the work. I looked at my son, 8 years old, sitting in the afternoon light with an expression that was entirely his own and also, unmistakably, something I recognized. Yes, I said, because I did the work. He nodded as though this confirmed a theory he had been developing. Okay, he said, and then, can we get pizza? We got pizza. I think about Franklin sometimes. The man I never met who spent decades building something careful and patient, who watched over a nephew from a distance without ever making himself known, who in his final act arranged the one thing he believed would be worth more than the money itself. I think about the letter, the line that stayed with me longest. The money is just the incentive to get you in the room. He was right. I know that now in the specific embodied way, you can only know something you have actually lived through, which is different from understanding it, different from agreeing with it, different from being able to articulate it on a Tuesday morning to a stranger in a diner while your coffee goes cold. I don't know if Franklin would look at what I'm doing now and feel that the condition had served its purpose. I hope so. I think so. Arthur still comes by Steady Ground sometimes, not as a resident anymore, but as what Patricia calls a community anchor, which is her way of saying he's someone the newer residents talk to because he's been there and he's still here, which is its own kind of proof. Curtis finished the first level of his welding certification in December. He texted me a photo of himself in full gear, holding the certification card up to the camera. I have the photo on my phone. I look at it sometimes on mornings when I'm not sure I'm doing things right. My mother came to Pittsburgh in the fall, before I moved back, to see Steady Ground. She stood in the common room and looked around at the bulletin boards and the donated bookshelves and the coffee station and the calendar on the wall with its handwritten entries, and she was quiet for a long moment in the way she's quiet when she's working something out. Then she said, "Your uncle knew what he was doing. I think she was right. I think he did."